a great pleasure to see so many people turn out for for a panel discussion on the Abhidharma. Back in the days when I started to study Buddhism, if you opened a course on Abhidharma, you might expect to get 2 or 3 people. But perhaps if we went on week after week, the group would gradually thin out till we were left with 2 or 3 people. I think Abhidharma has a certain mystique about it. And then once you have to study it seriously, then you can see that it requires sustained effort and keen attention. Okay, I see Abhidharma, as I call it, a kind of continuation of the thrust of original Buddhism as preserved in the early Buddhist discourses, the Nikayas or the Agamas. We could say that the aim of the Buddha's original teachings, there are several aims of the Buddha's original teachings. One is to teach people how to avoid unwholesome types of behavior which create unwholesome karma that leads to unhappy or miserable states of rebirth. The second is to show people how to cultivate wholesome courses of behavior, types of action that creates wholesome karma and that will lead to favorable states of rebirth and to gradual spiritual progress. And then the third overriding aim of the Buddha's teaching is to show the way to liberation from the whole cycle of birth and death, this attainment of nibbana. Now, what is characteristic, what underlies all 3 projects of the Buddha's teaching is a focus on the mind as the originating source of all action, thought, karma, and through our karma, the originator or the creator of our future destiny. And so from the earliest period, the Buddha's teaching focused upon the understanding, the training, the mastery, and the liberation of the mind. We find this already in the very first verses of the Pali Dhammapada, Mano Pubhangama Dhamma, Mano Setta, Mano Maya, that mind is the forerunner of all dhammas, mind is the chief, they are all mind-made. Now, in his program for liberation, the Buddha taught that the root of our bondage, the root of our bondage to samsara, the round of birth and death, is ignorance or avidya. And so to achieve spiritual progress and liberation, what has to be done is to overcome ignorance. And the antidote to ignorance is wisdom, insight, correct cognition. But what is meant by wisdom or correct cognition? Now, according to the Brahminic systems, as expressed, for example, in the Upanishads, the aim of knowledge, the ultimate object of knowledge, is the Atman, the self which is conceived to be permanent being, to be awareness or consciousness, and to be ever blissful. Now, the Buddha's teaching sort of knocks the self out of the center of the picture. It's not that the Buddha explicitly denies the self and says there is no self, but rather he focuses upon the correct cognition of mental and material phenomena. In his formulation of the Four Noble Truths in the first discourse, the Buddha lays down specific tasks that are to be performed in relation to each of the Noble Truths. And he says the Noble Truth of suffering is to be understood. The Noble Truth of the cause of suffering is to be abandoned or eliminated. The Noble Truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized, and the noble truth of the path is to be cultivated, to be developed. And so we see here that the noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood, and the ultimate referent of the first noble truth is the five aggregates. And so the task laid out for the practitioner is to fully understand the nature of the five aggregates, or the five components into which the Buddha classifies the factors of our existence. To know the five aggregates means to know exactly what is meant by each of the aggregates, to know its distinctive characteristic, to know how it functions in the complex of experience, to know how it becomes manifest to us through observation, and to know how it originates and how it passes away or ceases. One also has to know, to understand the second noble truth, one has to know the whole process of the origination of suffering, which also means the origination of the five aggregates that make up experience, and how to bring an end to this repeated process of the five aggregates. And so we see that the Buddha places cognition, right cognition, in the very center of his teaching. And it is this right cognition that eliminates ignorance and leads to liberation. In the early period, probably the monks, the Buddha and the early generation of monks, analyzed, dissected, and explored the nature of five aggregates or 12 sense bases, dependent origination in various ways. But the Buddha taught in a fairly general way and left the more detailed exploration of the implications of his teaching to the monks themselves. And so we could suppose that as time went on, the inquiry into the nature of the factors of existence became increasingly theoretical, which is not to say that it became abstract or remote from meditative experience, but rather that the explorations began to take place at a more, let's say, refined level, seeking greater precision, greater extensive detail. And this brought about a corresponding need to integrate the different strands of thought that were developing into an overarching, all-encompassing framework. And so I would see this to be what I call the nucleus or seed for the unfolding of the Abhidharma, the attempt to develop a comprehensive framework into which the more pragmatic and practical expositions of the Buddha's teaching could be incorporated. Okay, this project of developing a framework in detail, in extensive detail, developed differently, probably in different Buddhist communities, probably originally because of geographical separation. But as time went on, different schools used different theoretical frameworks as the overarching scheme for bringing together these different schemes of thought. Now, within the Theravada tradition, we could say that the broad map of the Abhidhamma divides states of consciousness in a way that will enable us to see exactly how they provide guidelines to spiritual development. So the primary, you say the axis or quadrants of the Abhidhamma system would be unwholesome states of consciousness, the kinds of states of consciousness that one has to overcome, and an understanding of what are the defilements that underlie those unwholesome states of consciousness. So what the Abhidharma texts do is to bring together the different schemes of defilements laid out in the suttas, in the Buddha's discourses, and try to show how these different schemes interlock, how they're interwoven, and how they are all just expressing different modalities or functions of a core group of unwholesome mental factors, the defilements. Then the sort of second grand domain of consciousness consists of the wholesome types of consciousness, the wholesome, mundane types of consciousness. And these are the types of consciousness which we are to cultivate in order to progress spiritually, to advance from one life to the next, and to experience happiness and well-being in this life and in future lives. And so the Abhidharma sets out what these states of consciousness are, what are the types of actions that generate these types of consciousness, and what are the wholesome states to be developed in order to experience these states of consciousness, these wholesome states of consciousness. Then the third great quadrant of states of consciousness explored in the Abhidharma are those states of consciousness which will culminate in liberation. And so when taking these states of consciousness, the Abhidharma system lays them out in a framework of layers of states of consciousness, going from the sense sphere wholesome consciousness to the different higher meditative planes, and then finally it takes the what's called the Lokuttara, world transcending or supramundane states of consciousness. And the Abhidharma, thinkers of the Abhidharma, take the wholesome groups of factors laid out by the Buddha in the discourses, the groups that are called the aids to enlightenment, like the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 right efforts, the 5 faculties, the 5 powers, 7 enlightenment factors, 8 path factors. And it shows how these states of these mental factors lie within the wholesome states of consciousness and how they are to be cultivated in order to rise up from the level of mundane mind to the higher meditative experiences, and eventually to develop them to the point where one overcomes all the defilements that bind one to the cycle of rebirths and reach the 4th domain of consciousness, which are the fruits of liberation. And so in this way, I would say that even though the Abhidharma definitely has theoretical components and is based upon a tightly interwoven set of texts, its primary purpose is practical and pragmatic, to give guidance and also to show in the abstract, the framework of states of consciousness that culminate in liberation.